Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Congresswoman Chrissy Houlihan's Telephone Town Hall. Tonight we will be focused on gun violence prevention. Thank you so much for joining. Two things. First, if you are at all interested in signing up for Chrissy's e-newsletter, please press 5 on your phone at any point throughout the call. Just hit the number 5. That'll enter you into our system so that we can get you subscribed and hear updates from Chrissy. Now, at any point during tonight's town hall, if you have a question, please press star 3. So at any point, if you have a question, press star 3, and you'll be entered into our queue where a member of Chrissy's staff will take down your question, and then we'll take you live. With that, I'd like to hand it over to Congresswoman Houlihan.
Thank you, Connor, and good evening to everyone, and thank you all for joining us for this telephone town hall, part of our anti-racism series. I'm really excited to have you all here tonight because tonight we're turning our focus to an issue that unfortunately continues to impact every community across our country, and the issue tonight is that of gun violence. As a mom and a veteran and a former educator, I am, like all of us, know that this is an issue that is an issue of our community. Here in the 6th Congressional District, we both respect the Second Amendment, but we also value community and individual safety. Nearly 40% of us here in our 6th Congressional District are gun owners, but a very large majority of us know and believe that we need to have these hard conversations and work towards making our community, commonwealth, and country a safer place. In this year alone, barely 5 months into the year, there have already been nearly 150 mass shootings in the United States. That is more mass shootings than days in the year so far. People have lost loved ones, family members, friends, and neighbors. Communities have been shattered and heartbroken. And it's due to an epidemic that has plagued this nation for years, and the epidemic is gun violence. Living in safe communities should not be a privilege. It shouldn't be a right that's afforded to. It should be a right that's afforded to every American, no matter their race or gender, no matter their income level or zip code. But year after year, we continue to bear witness to countless mass shootings, as well as other shooting deaths, both intentional and unintentional. Even in 2020, during the worst pandemic this country has ever seen, gun violence still killed nearly 20,000 Americans, with another 24,000 Americans dying by suicide with a gun. This made it the deadliest year for gun violence deaths in the last 2 decades. When I first ran for Congress in 2018, I knew I wasn't alone in my frustration for government inaction. So many of you asked me on the campaign trail about what we could do as a federal government to save lives, to curb gun violence, and to create those safe communities that everyone deserves to live in. For my part, I've tried to honor that promise. So twice now, both in the last Congress and now in this Congress, we've passed historic legislation that has bipartisan support and could go a long way to help curb the devastating effects of gun violence. First, we passed the Bipartisan Background Checks Act, which would make it illegal for any person who's not a licensed firearm importer, manufacturer, or dealer to transfer a firearm to any other person who's not licensed without a background check. Part of our jobs as leaders is to listen to those who sent us here and to advocate on their behalf. 94% of American voters support universal background checks. That is a staggering statistic. And so I'll continue to press the Senate to move forward on this popular bill that has the potential to save lives. A second bill I also want to mention on this call that also has bipartisan support is the Enhanced Background Checks Act, which will close the deadly Charleston loophole and will ensure that delayed background checks don't put lives at risk. These 2 pieces of legislation are not by any means the end-all be-all, but they do mark a very important first step. And I, like many of you on the line, am committed to enacting policies that curb gun violence and save lives. So tonight's town hall also marks the 3rd in our anti-racism policy series, as I mentioned. And when we're talking about gun violence, we must address the fact that it disproportionately impacts Americans of color. According to the Brady campaign, Black Americans are twice as likely as white Americans to die from gun violence and 14 times more likely than white Americans to be wounded. Gun violence alone reduces the life expectancy of Black Americans by 4 years. According to Everytown for Gun Safety, Black Americans also experience 3 times the fatal police shootings of white Americans. For many in our community, our Commonwealth, and our country, this past year has represented a watershed moment in the effort to address systemic racism. And it's crucial that we have these conversations because we all have a role to play. Our country will only be made stronger by our efforts to build a more equitable nation, and gun violence is very much a part of that conversation. And so tonight, I'm so grateful to be joined by a friend and a colleague, Representative Lucy McBath, a congresswoman from Georgia's 6th Congressional District. So we both represent the 6th Congressional Districts of our states. She's one of the foremost leaders on the issue of gun safety and gun violence in the House of Representatives. As you will hear, her connection to this issue is deeply personal, and her work to save lives is nothing short of heroic, in my opinion. And I'm really grateful to have her with us tonight. It is a true gift. And with that, I'd like to hand it over to Representative Lucy McBath for her comments and opening remarks.
Well, good evening, everyone, and thank you, Christy and staff, so much for having me on tonight. I really, really appreciate it, and really glad to be able to speak with your own constituents. And I'm so grateful for the opportunity to be able to connect with each of you to talk about one of the issues that matters most to our families, which is gun safety. And I'd like to let you know, for those constituents that are on, Chrissy is a champion in Washington, and she works on your behalf so diligently, works so hard each and every day. And I'm sure that you know how blessed you are to have her in service to you. But as we move into what we all hope is the last leg of this pandemic, I just really want to take the time to thank all of you on the call tonight for doing the hard work, the difficult work over this last year to keep our friends and our neighbors safe. And I know that every single American has felt, very serious changes to their everyday lives over this past year, and your dedication and your compassion towards your family and your loved ones has never been more important than it is right now. And, for over a year now, parents across the country have found themselves as full-time employees and full-time teachers and full-time caregivers. And, parenting, even the best of times, is just not easy. And so as we move into, hopefully, what we find a brighter summer, I hope that all of you can find some time to celebrate your resilience. And truly, your actions have just made a difference in the lives of your families and your loved ones. And when it's safe for you and your family to see each other, I hope that you take the time to laugh and just to share love with them in person, because, we have seen over the last year, the time that we've spent with loved ones has never been more important. And my own story of motherhood just kind of starts like many women in America for years. And I'm just going to give you a little bit of my backstory. But for years, I struggled to get pregnant, and I wasn't sure I was ever going to be able to have a child. And finally, my son Jordan, who we all called a miracle in our family, he was a miracle for us. We were just so excited that I was able to have him, and he was just a true miracle for me and my growing family. And as I watched Jordan grow up, I live in Marietta, Georgia. I represent Georgia's 6th Congressional District. It was just truly a blessing to see him just mature into such a caring, compassionate young man. He was always concerned about people outside of himself, and he was always concerned that everyone had access to the things that he, had access to. And he wanted to make sure that, if I was giving him a popsicle, he would, empty out the refrigerator, the ice box, and make sure that all of his friends had popsicles too. And so, I saw him grow into a caring and compassionate young man, and I dreamed of who he would become. And I dreamed of watching him walking across the stage at his high school graduation. And I dreamed of watching him attending college, getting married. And I always kept saying, I hope you give me grandchildren one day. I was looking forward to perhaps him starting a family of his own. But on Black Friday in 2012, which is the day right after Thanksgiving, Jordan was in Jacksonville, Florida with his father, and he was sitting in the back seat of a friend's car. So he just simply stopped at a gas station for some chewing gum. They were going from mall to mall, and Jordan said to the boys, to his friends, there were 3 others in the car with him, he said, hey, guys, If we're going to go to the mall and, get girls, we got to have fresh breath. So stop to get some chewing gum. And they stopped in a convenience store, gas station, within the 3.5 minutes that they actually were sitting there waiting for the driver of the car to come out. A man pulls up next to them, and he complains about the loud music that they were playing. He called the boys gangbangers and thugs. He says he didn't like their thug music. And he started a verbal altercation with the boys and told them to turn their thug music down. And in particular, he started a verbal altercation with my son, Jordan. Jordan was basically saying, look, we're not bothering you. We're not doing anything, just leave us alone, roll up your window. And, Michael Dunn, feeling empowered by his prejudice and by his racially profiling the boys as gangbangers and thugs without even knowing who they were. He felt empowered by the gun that he had in his glove box. And so he turned and he reached into his glove box and he pulled out his 9mm Glock and he shot 10 rounds into the car, hitting Jordan 3 times, killing my only son. And then he simply sped off into the night with his girlfriend in the car with him. And my son Jordan was only 17. And the country called our killing, our story, the National Loud Music Killing. And, I felt that injustice. For months, I prayed out to God about how could this happen to me and my family and to Jordan. And we spent, from beginning to end, we spent 2.5 years in court trying to get convictions for my son and his friends. And it was, outside of losing my son, some of the most painful, debilitating times in my life. And I spent many, 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 many days in the courtroom for the pretrial motions and then for the court proceedings itself, which there were 2. My son Jordan, in the first trial that we had, the man that killed my son, Michael Dunn, was convicted of attempted murder for the other 3 boys and was sentenced to 30 years in prison for the attempted murder on the other 3 boys. However, on my son's charges, even with witnesses, even with people who saw and heard what happened, we had a hung jury on my son's first-degree murder charges. The painful thing is that people said to us, after the first trial, I said, well, you should be happy. You had some vindication. You had some justice. Michael Dunn got 90 years. You should be good enough with that. And adding insult to injury as if my son's life didn't matter. And we were not going to lay down. We pushed our legal team to go back into the courtroom again. Mind you, this happened in Jacksonville, Florida. And so we had just watched what happened with Trayvon Martin in his case, and we had the same attorneys, the same state's attorneys as the Trayvon Martin case. We went back to court again and trying Jordan's charges, and thank God we had a first-degree murder charge conviction for Michael Dunn for my son's murder, plus an additional 15 years was handed to Michael Dunn for shooting in an open public place. So now Michael Dunn sits in prison for life with no parole for the 90 years, 30 years for each of the attempted murder charges on the other 3 boys in the car, the first-degree murder of my son, Jordan, and plus an additional 15 years for shooting in an open public place. And this is one of the only national cases probably now outside of the George Floyd conviction when there's, a national high-profile shooting, where there's on black males and there's a conviction. And so, I spent a lot of time on my knees praying, praying for my child and praying for my family. And in those prayers, that's actually how I found the strength to really forgive my son's killer. Yes, I have forgiven him. I truly don't believe that I would be able to do the work that God has called me to do now in gun violence prevention in Congress had I not been able to do so. Because what I recognize is that even though Michael Dunn may have taken Jordan's life, he could never take his legacy. This would not and could never be the end of my son's story. I made a promise that I would act and that I would stand up for families like mine, not only in Marietta, Georgia, but all families across the country who are just terrified that they're going to send their kids off to school one day, terrified that their kids are going to be playing loud music in their car, terrified that, their children or someone's going to be running down the street, jogging, terrified that, that their loved ones will simply be laying in bed one day and won't wake up, or they'll never see them come home, terrified that one day they're really going to be me. And that's what I try to do in Washington every single day. I fight so hard to protect families all across America so that they will not be me. It's why I wake up every day to fight on behalf of the, families, millions of families across America who are doing all that they can just to keep their families healthy and safe. So I just am really grateful to be able to talk with you tonight. Thank you all so much again for being here to hear my story. And thank you to Chrissy for inviting me to speak and be part of today's discussion. I'm so proud to be serving alongside her in Congress as she helps me to initiate policy to keep our families safe, with gun safety. And I do have to say this, I always have to say this, is that I'm a strong supporter of the Second Amendment. I come from a family of gun owners, and my father was a hunter. And so I do support people's ability to be able to protect themselves if they truly are faced with a credible threat of danger. But there again, in the extremist culture that we're living under, we really cannot allow people to act as vigilantes and to take the law into their own hands. And so I hope to continue to be able to pass legislation that protects every person in this country, whether they are a gun owner or not. And law-abiding gun owners, I always say, need have no fear for the gun safety legislation that we're putting forth, because they, within minutes, will be able to purchase the guns and ammunition that they want to. There are a lot of law-abiding hunters and gun collectors and skeet shooters, and those are absolutely not the ones that we have to be mindful of. But we have an extremist growing culture in the country, and under COVID-19, exponentially more guns have been sold in this country than in the entire history of America. And so, yes, the country is under siege with gun violence. And it is now a public health crisis that we are living through each and every day. And not any one of us is immune to this gun crisis. Not one of us. And so my goal is to make sure that I live the rest of my life to support everyone's ability to be able to live fully in this nation without the fear of being gunned down, without the fear of being able to walk in your own communities, without the fear of existing. That is your right. That is not a privilege. So thank you once again, and thank you, Chrissy, and I'm so happy to turn it back to you.
Thank you, Lucy. And I hope that you all who are able to join us and those who are able to listen to this later understand just what a remarkable gift that we have in Lucy, and how she's taken what is such an awful and painful and personal and private experience and really turned it towards finding goodness for the country. And I'm really, really grateful that she's here sharing what has to be a remarkably difficult story over and over again, so that it can hopefully benefit us all. The way that we'd like to proceed from here, Lucy, is I have a couple of questions that I'd like to ask of you. because most of our town halls, we work on the basis of inviting an expert. And you are an expert, on this, whether you have asked for it or not. You have become that. And so I have a couple questions that seem to be things that people ask me a great deal, which is the first one is, so we talk about this a lot, and you've come back and you've said we've passed these things in the House twice, historic bipartisan pieces of legislation. What is preventing this from happening in the Senate? What does it take to do to get the Senate to do something? And what can an individual citizen in a community do to get involved and to help?
Well, thank you, Chrissy, for that. And, I know there's a great deal of angst across the country. And, citizens say all the time, this is just common sense legislation. It just makes sense. 97% of the American population believe in the fact that we must do something and we must enact gun safety legislation. So, and really what this is really about at the core is just saving lives. And, I really hope and pray that there will be a time where there, will be no longer, the Senate and those that have been reluctant to do the right thing. I hope that there will be a time when they will no longer just kind of turn their backs on the hundreds of thousands of people who have been killed. We've got over 100 people in the country every single day who are killed with guns. That's not even talking about the numbers who have been maimed and critically hurt and will suffer from those injuries for the rest of their lives, just unnecessarily due to our inability to pass common sense reforms. And so, we are public servants, you and I, and many of you that are on this call. You are public servants, and we're supposed to serve, human beings. We're supposed to serve our constituents. We're supposed to serve our community. We're supposed to protect them and keep them safe. And to put politics and profit before public safety is absolutely disgraceful. And that is what we find happening over and over and over again when the NRA gun lobby, even though it's somewhat dismantled at this point, don't discount them because they still have a lot of power and authority, and they are in the back pockets and have been so in the back pockets of a lot of our colleagues in Washington. Their history has been that they have been pre-crafting a lot of this legislation to loosen the restrictions on gun laws all across the country. And in doing so, those legislators take that pre-crafted legislation and they put it on the House floor and they're charged with passing it. And in a sense, there's almost a sense of intimidation for them. It's like, you need to pass this legislation, otherwise we're not going to support you financially. And that's not what democracy is. That's not what people deserve. And so I say, whether you're Republican or Democrat or independent or libertarian, everyone deserves to be protected, and we must do more to make that a reality. And we must not allow those leaders that are willing to put profit over public safety, we must not allow them to continue in the vein that they have. And so in the last few months, yes, I've been leading the charge to pass common sense gun violence prevention bills like H.R. 8, which is the universal background checks, and also H.R. 1446, which is a bill that would close the Charleston loophole. But mind you, I'd been doing this work trying to pass these very pieces of legislation even before I came to Congress. As a gun safety advocate, I would come to Washington and sit in the committee bill markups on the Judiciary Committee, which I am now a part of, and watch over and over and over again as my colleagues would put forth amendments trying to keep people safe. And then the Republican Party would be, knocking down those amendments. There again, we would not be able to successfully pass legislation. And so, in the day that President Biden introduced his initiatives, I introduced a bill that President Biden called for, which is a federal red flag law, which is legislation that actually gives families and law enforcement more tools to help keep guns out of the hands of loved ones who are posing a danger to themselves or others. People that appear to be in crisis and have access to guns or own them. This gives law enforcement with the families the opportunity to go to, to the judge, to the judge and basically petition to have those guns and ammunition taken from that individual until it's ascertained whether or not that individual is no longer in crisis. And then that individual would still have to pass a federal background check to have those guns returned to him or her. So, as we continue to fight for all these pieces of legislation, I urge everyone, please use your voices. Call your federal representatives. Call your state representatives. Email them. Text them. Get involved. I can tell you, when I was acting as a gun safety advocate before becoming the policymaker, and I would be sitting in the offices with a lot of the Republican lawmakers in Washington and around the country, I would say, 97% of the Americans in the country, they agree with me. Why do you not see how important it is to even protect your own constituents? But what they would say to me is that, well, if all these folks agree with you, where are they? We don't hear from them. So we have to be able to, yes, it's important to rally and to march and to be in the streets, but you've got to be willing to bombard those legislators with emails, bombard them with texts, bombard them when they're in their state offices, when they're at home on recess, when you can. Of course, I know that under COVID it's difficult to do so, but you've got to be willing to make sure that they know that you mean business, and that if they're not willing to protect you and your community, they're going to be voted out of office. Make sure that your representatives know that preventing gun violence is an issue of life or death, and that we all have to take part in ending gun violence and keeping families safe all across America. And we just need to make sure that our leaders hear us on these issues. Legislators need to know directly from us that, we're standing for real change, and we're not going to stand by needlessly and let people continue to die, our loved ones, anymore.
And thank you, Lucy. I think that the real clear message is, be active and be involved. Let your elected representatives understand where your position is on these issues. And if for whatever reason that elected representative isn't where you are, make sure that you're supporting candidates who are. One thing that I do take heart in is that some of the bipartisan votes that we did receive for these pieces of legislation indeed did come from Pennsylvanians. And so there is a conversation still to be had. I haven't given up hope in Pennsylvania that we have the ability to act bipartisanly on these issues, because we've shown that we can in the past. So please, don't give up hope. Make sure that you're continuing to, advocate for these issues with every representative that you have in your Rolodex. Let's move to the next question, which is another, piece of tragedy in our country, which we've experienced recently, which is the recent decision on the Derek Chauvin found guilty, as we know, of 3 different counts of murder. And we've spoken tonight a great deal about gun violence. And I know that both you and I were co-sponsors of the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. And I also wanted to mention that I'm also a co-sponsor of your Red Flag Act. And I'm hopeful that we'll have the opportunity to work together on that as well. But could you talk real briefly about your thoughts on that piece of legislation, and where can we hope to go as a country from here on the issue of police reform, and also on where this goes potentially in the Senate?
Well, Chrissy, thank you for that. I mean, it's always really important to remember that in these cases, that no matter what the outcome, there's nothing that can ever bring our loved ones back. There's nothing that will ever bring George Floyd back to his family. No system is truly just until everyone is treated equally in the eyes of the law. And this is just really the beginning. This verdict for the George Floyd family, I think it's just the beginning nationally, and I think people are really understanding how much work we have yet to do. We still have such a long way to go to make sure that justice is justified for every family, every tragedy. And too often, officers who are using excessive force are not held accountable for their actions. And it's just unfortunate that there's often such a higher degree of uncertainty as to whether or not justice is actually going to be served in cases like this. I mean, we find ourselves holding our breath over and over and over again, waiting for these verdicts, oftentimes, so disappointed, so sorely disappointed with the criminal verdicts. And then, of course, the families are receiving monetary awards, which is really, in my mind, there's no amount of money that a family can ever receive for the loss of a loved one unjustly. And that's why passing the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act is just so critically necessary. Some police we know that there are some police that are already doing some really good work. I have to honestly say I'm so grateful for the law enforcement that serve in my district. They do really, really good work. They respect the community. And and our community respects the work that they do, and they really serve my community. And and they have the trust of their communities. And many law enforcement communities do have that same kind of trust, and and relationship with the people that they are entrusted to care for. But George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, it's a bill which works to make sure that more of our police departments look like our best police departments. That's why it's so vitally important that we really put a lot of muscle behind trying to pass this legislation, because it really does invest in the safety of our neighborhoods by creating community programs that build trust and also helps to support gold standard training for law enforcement, and establishes these fact-based plans designed to keep American families healthy and whole. Transparency, when one police officer goes from state to state or from one precinct to another, those files and records are also transferred with that, that officer. That's transparency. But also, too, making sure that we're investing in the ability for our law enforcement officers to not have to deal with situations that escalate, and oftentimes these confrontations, situations that they're not equipped to deal with. Making sure that we can put somebody on the beat with them to enable them to have an individual that can help in those crisis situations. And, while we work to pass that at the federal level, we've just got to continue to push at the local level and at the grassroots level, because that's where most of the change usually happens. And we've got to hold, police accountability forums, spend time with police precincts, hold town halls with the community and law enforcement, open up that dialogue at the local level and bring law enforcement to city council meetings, set up community organizations to build relationships with law enforcement, build that sense of organization, and take responsibility for building that sense of community. I really pray that George Floyd's family finds a sense of peace, and I know that for justice to continue to be built going forward, we've just never got to stop fighting to prevent these kinds of injustices like the one that took his life and so many other lives.
Thank you. I agree. And I know that we only have you for a very short amount of time remaining, because you have to, as we all do, run to do a different event. But in the last couple of minutes that I have you, first a reminder, I will be staying on after Lucy, Representative McBath leaves for a couple questions. But I have one last question for you, but a reminder to people who are here, please, if you do have questions, hit *3. And we will attempt to make sure that we have time for you. And if we are, for whatever reason, not able to get to your question, a reminder that we will answer within 48 hours, any of the questions that we're not able to get to in the time that we have. And Lucy, our Representative McBath, with our last couple of seconds, what you've gone through is really, truly every parent's worst nightmare. And you are now in Congress, propelled there in the same way that I feel propelled for other reasons to be here. And you are one of the foremost leaders in the nation on gun violence and gun violence prevention legislation. And I know that you've had the opportunity as a result, as I have on much, much smaller scale, to speak with so many families who have lost loved ones to gun violence. What is your message to those families? particularly in the wake of recent mass shootings?
I want families in particular that have suffered from, gun violence in particular, move forward again. You've got to continue to live. Just do your best to find ways to fill the emptiness, because that's what your loved one would want you to do. And also too, as victims, tell your story. Your story inspires friends and communities and legislation to work together to help enact gun safety. You never know who your story is going to help, and it might inspire your federal legislators to enact policies like us, to enact policies. It inspires us to do the work to help keep our families safe and whole. Just find ways to make a difference for others. Find ways to feel, as whole as you possibly can. But please take care of yourself. Self-care is critically important. It's so vital because, so many of our loved ones and family are still depending on us. And I truly believe that, all the lives that we've lost, all of our loved ones, I really believe that we're going to see them again one day. So have hope in that, live for that, and just live for them.
Thank you so much, Representative McBath, for your time and your work and your words. And I'm very grateful on behalf of my community when I say thank you so much for joining us tonight. And I'll let you hop off, and I'll see you down in D.C. In fact, the first time I ever got to go to a State of the Union, and tomorrow, as you might remember, there will be one, I was able to bring a member of my community whose daughter, unfortunately, died from gun violence. And it was the only time I've been able to go to a State of the Union, because the next one was of course, during COVID. So I really speak for my community when I say thank you so much for being with us tonight, and I look forward to continuing to work with you on these kinds of really important issues.
Well, you as well, and I enjoyed being with you. Thank you so much, and take care.
Of course. Of course. And with that, I think we'll transition back over to Connor. And Connor, do we have some questions from our community that we might be able to answer in the couple of minutes that we have remaining?
We do, yes. So our question today comes from Anna Marie in Kennett Square. So Anna Marie, you should now be on the line. Anna Marie, do we have
Hello.
you?
Yes,
Hello.
I'm sorry, I'm here. Hi. How are you tonight?
I'm good, thank you.
I just wanted to know, with the plans for the gun laws, how are we going to address like the mental health part of the gun violence? Since many times it is associated with the mental health portion, and then still to be balancing the right of the consumer for the Second Amendment to be able to be a gun owner.
Yeah, and I think that that's a really, really critical question and very appropriate question to ask. There clearly is a connection between people who struggle with mental health issues and access to guns. And part of what Lucy was talking about in the piece of legislation that is called the Red Flag Laws speaks to that, trying to support legislation like that speaks to, if you're a member of a person's family and you see something that alarms you, in their mental health, you should have a possibility to be able to help them not have the same easy access to a gun. And that's to some degree what these red flag laws are looking at. Also, importantly, in December of 2019, we were for the first time able to appropriate and approve funding, $25 million, in fact, for the NIH, for the National Institute of Health. And that was funding that was, in fact, allocated or marked for research on gun violence as a public health problem. This was the first time that we were able to do that, and it also had bipartisan support, which is pretty remarkable. The last thing that I will say is I'm a veteran, as I mentioned at the beginning of the call. I'm obviously a woman as well. Veterans have a higher likelihood to die by suicide than their civilian counterparts. And so this is something that really resonates with me and matters to me greatly and personally, as my father and grandfather are vets, as well as many members of my family. And so some of the legislative actions that I've been taking in the last Congress and this one have to do with that population and making sure that particularly that population and the mental health issues that they struggle with are being thought about. A particular example is a piece of legislation that we were able to pass through all the way to the president's desk, President Trump's desk, for signature last session, and it had to do with making sure that those who didn't necessarily have access to the VA, veterans, did have access to other programs within their communities if they were struggling with mental health issues or they were struggling with suicidal ideations. We recognize that the number of suicides in the veteran population are, if anything, increasing, and we need to be doing something about that. And in many of those cases, they are gun-related. And so some of the work that we're doing, again, bipartisanly, a member of Congress named Representative Bergman and I worked on the House side on that, was to focus on that population as well. So there's a lot of work to be done, and you're right, it's complicated. It's not just about, background checks, but it is about, as we've talked about, red flag laws and mental health issues as well. I think that we are able, if it's okay, to move to the next question.
Yes, thank you, Anna Marie. So we have time for one more question. Yep, we've got time for one more question this evening. There are a number in the queue, though, so as Chrissy mentioned, we will have our staff call anyone who had a question back within 48 hours. So apologies that we couldn't get to everyone. We have a lot of people on the line, so we want to thank everyone for coming. But of course, for now, I want to hand it over to Pam in Chester County. Pam, you should now be on the line.
Yes, I would like to know would like to say that the House of Representatives do a great job in getting necessary current bills over to the Senate, but we're not getting anything done with them once they get to the Senate. And some of those bills are really, really crucial to we, the people out in the communities. What or the senators on the oppositional side plan to do about this? I really think that we should definitely get rid of that filibuster, which is hindering the people's business to be done. It's not right that we pay for senators that are not working.
Thank you, Pam.
I really appreciate. Oh, thank you, Connor. And Pam, I really appreciate the sentiment and the frustration. It's palpable in your voice, and I feel the same frustration. This is something, as Representative McBath was talking about, that we all, have the ability to do something about with our voice and with our vote, and, calling our senators. I really genuinely believe that moves the needle in some of these cases, and particularly as I try to emphasize in our own state of Pennsylvania. I think that we could possibly see movement on these kinds of pieces of legislation if we just keep at it, because this is something that I think I see wobbling on the members of the Senate from our own state. And so please keep at it. We very much want to also respect the way that the Congress is designed to work, and I do know that one of the opportunities there is thinking about the filibuster. I think at this point in time that is, of course, with the Senate to consider. But I do really want to see our government continue to work for the people, and I do really believe that we can continue to call our elected representatives. And if we don't like the way that they're working on pieces of legislation or advocating for us, then we have the opportunity very shortly to be able to vote for them or for somebody else. Thanks, Pam, for your question.
And that takes us
and with that, I
to the
think
end, Christy, now. Yep.
Yeah, I'm afraid that I have another commitment, and indeed I have a commitment which I think is kind of probably, I hope, is interesting to you all here on the phone. I serve on the Foreign Affairs Committee, I specifically serve on the Asia subcommittee, and so unfortunately I need to head off of this call and go ahead and join my counterparts in the Japanese equivalent of the House of Representatives to speak about the issue of, interestingly enough, women in government, and I'm looking forward to doing that, and unfortunately that's why I need to head out at this time. But I do really want to thank you for joining us tonight for this part of our series and these conversations that are very, very difficult to have. I recognize that, but they're just so vital. And I really, really appreciate the fact that we in this community have those conversations and that we have them, and as we've just heard, in a really respectful and civil tone, because I think that's really important. And I'll continue to work with my colleagues, as we've talked about, like Representative Lucy McBath and like Representative Bergman, on issues of veteran suicide that we talked about, on both sides of the aisle, to write and pass policies that will make our communities safer. And as a reminder that my office is your office, and that if you do have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out. As Connor mentioned, if you did have a question that we weren't able to get to, we'll call you back. We've got lots of folks taking your questions on the line within 48 hours. And thank you as always. I can't wait for the opportunity to see you all in person. I think we're getting there. It's the honor and a privilege of a lifetime to be able to serve with you in Congress, and please do stay safe. Thank you.